Hey, Chrontendo episode 37 is here at last, though very, very late. But it's a big ol' massive episode featuring a classic adventure game, a whacked out RPG, a Japanese adventure game from Capcom, and some Famicom Disk System junk. But the exciting thing is the 1988 Arcade Roundup. Yep, just like the 1987 Arcade Roundup, we'll take a look at the biggest, bestest games to hit arcades in 1988. This allows us not only to compare contemporary arcade games with what was happening on the Famicom, but we'll also be seeing a lot of games that later will get ported to consoles. So, let's get started. From Hector, or Hecht, we have America Daitouryou Senkyo, or United State Election, as the cover says, which is a 1988 presidential election simulation game. Yeah, you heard that right. Good timing, I suppose, since it came out right before the election. The intro will show us the candidates. We have Bush, as in George Herbert Walker. Sasha. Is this supposed to be Margaret Thatcher? She's described as a senator from Michigan. Roberts, that would be Pat Robertson. The televangelist. There's also, of course, Michael Dukakis and Jesse Jackson. And finally, Suzuki, a fictional senator from California. Oddly, the US Wikipedia claims Al Gore is among the candidates, but he isn't listed in the intro. So either Wikipedia is wrong, imagine that, or he's like a hidden character or something. So you pick your character, I'll choose Bush, I guess. Here's his stats, including his blood type, naturally. And oh yes, he's a WASP, in case you didn't know that. I guess WASP is a readily understood acronym in Japan? It's a little surprising. So here you begin your grueling year-long campaign. You know, there's actually very little in this game in terms of graphics, but the artwork on the faces is pretty good. It was supposedly developed by Hector themselves. You need to choose your position on a number of issues. I'll select environment, and in the sub-choices I'll go for air pollution regulation. For each issue you need to move your elephant, in this case, along the bar to indicate whether you lean in favor of it or against it. This will affect how much certain groups in the populace will favor you. This one here is automobile import restrictions. There's a whole bunch of Japan-based issues. And Thatcher is described as being anti-Japan, and Suzuki is pro-Japan, so Japan actually figures heavily in this election. The game is almost entirely text-based. It sort of resembles the stock market games like Wall Street Kid, except with voter popularity replacing wealth. I wonder, who was this aimed at? An older audience, I assume, since the game contains massive amounts of kanji, whereas most games contain just use hiragana, which is easier for kids to read. Wow, the game's just started, I'm already in the lead. Really a quite baffling game, and the inclusion of Margaret Thatcher in the election adds a surreal touch. So an interesting game, but one that's going to be impossible to play unless you're very familiar with kanji. Moving right along, we have our first FDS game this episode, from Taito, Yuu Maze, which means maze play, perhaps? Clear the labyrinth and rescue your brother. So don't expect any heavy-duty plot here, folks. There's a few options, including the options to create your own maze. And once the game begins, wow, so this really is a maze game. An old-school game where you run around in a maze and try not to get hit. There are different colors of dots, though the only difference here seems to be the number of points they give. And those swirly-looking fan blade things are warps. You can warp from one to the other. After clearing the maze of dots, you'll then move on to the next round. Pretty simple-looking game, huh? Obviously, this would have been pretty cool back in 1981, but I guess it could have even have passed as an early pre-Mario Famicom game, but releasing such a game in late 1988 seems a little perverse. Maybe this was a deliberate attempt at a retro game? The game does add a few elements as you progress, power-ups that let you kill enemies. There are gray dots that turn green when you run them over, and then you have to run them over again in order to pick them up. The game also gets harder with some enemy vehicles moving much faster than you. So, Yuu Maze is not exactly terrible, but as I've previously noted, Daitouryou really seems to be dedicated to underachievement when it comes to its Famicom releases, and Yuu Maze certainly fits into that pattern. A couple of significant historical notes here. First of all, October 29th marks an important day in video game history, since that was the day that Sega, despite not having much luck with a Master System, launched a new console, the Sega Mega Drive. This was right about a year after the PC Engine, and unlike that console, the Mega Drive was undoubtedly a full 16-bit system. Eventually, the Mega Drive would find great success in the US as the Genesis, as well as in Europe and elsewhere, but in Japan the Mega Drive didn't draw that much attention, and Sega's new console took third place in the Japanese console wars, after the Famicom and the PC Engine. Additionally, Nintendo managed to steal whatever thunder Sega had a month later. For the last year or so, there had been talk of Nintendo's own 16-bit project, known as the Super Famicom. Finally, on November 22nd, Nintendo publicly unveiled the new system. A demonstration was held that day for the Japanese press. The console shown that day was, from a technical standpoint, very similar to the final version of the Super Famicom, except that it had much less memory. Still, by late 1988, the Super Famicom was pretty much complete, so it's a little surprising that it wasn't actually released until late 1990. Perhaps the Famicom was so successful there that Nintendo didn't want to render it obsolete when it was still making money. So for the next 2 years, Nintendo would just tantalize gamers with peeks at the new system. Still, the fact that Nintendo had a 16-bit system ready by 1988 shows that the end of the 8-bit era really is upon us. We've seen plenty of military strategy games for the Famicom over the last 11 months or so, and now for the big one, the granddaddy of them all, Sengoku from Koei, the first in a series of about 1 million games based on the Three Kingdoms period of Chinese history. And much like Nobunaga's Ambition, Koei did a crazy thing. They translated it into English and released it on the NES under the name Romance of the Three Kingdoms. When you fire up the game, you'll need to make some choices from a variety of options, starting with picking one of the 5 scenarios, each based on a point in time during the late Han Dynasty or the Three Kingdoms period. Also, you need to choose who you want to play as. These were some of the major figures of this period. I'll go with Cao Cao, perhaps the most famous warlord of the period. Oh, and this game is for up to 8 players at once, by the way. And so far, this works very much like Nobunaga's Ambition. You gotta choose your stats here. But first, let's do a little bit of a backstory to this game. Now, we just saw a Namco game called Sengoku a few episodes ago, but here's a reminder about there being 2 different literary works with similar titles. The earliest one, what we call the Record of the Three Kingdoms in English, it's a rather dry historical document, and this game is technically named after this book. Much more well known is the later fictionalized version called Romance of the Three Kingdoms. It's considered to be one of the 4 classic Chinese novels, so technically the Japanese and English titles for this game refer to different works. But they both tell the same story, so it's no big deal. The game made its first appearance on the PC-88 in 1985, then it was ported to other Japanese computers, including the MSX, seen here. These computer versions all look pretty similar, and the console version isn't really that much different. Sengoku was, I believe, Koei's first historic strategy game, and it sort of set the template for many of their later games. But the NES game wasn't even the first English release. Romance of the Three Kingdoms came out for DOS computers in 1988, and for the Amiga a little later. The graphics were different. On the DOS version, there's pretty much no music, and the game works much better on a PC than a console. Strategy games were pretty popular on computers at the time, so a DOS release makes perfect sense. Anyway, here's the main map. I control number 7, though the map doesn't tell you that. You have to remember which section corresponds to which warlord. From your main control screen, you choose what you want to do for your turn. View allows you to see the other warlords, or masters as the game calls them. You can check on their territory for info on their money, army, etc. You can conduct war or diplomacy, or you can give gifts, marry off your daughters to another warlord, recruit men for your army. Search has you look around the territory for interesting people to recruit as generals. See, here I'm training my men, thus increasing their strength in battle. But also very important in this campaign is moving your men into unoccupied lands. For example, territory number 6 is not under my control or any other warlords, so I can just take a general and some men and basically just move right in. You'll need to spend money and rice to do so, but having more land produces more rice. This is the expansion part of the game. You need to sort of build up your wealth and your army. Now, one thing you probably should not do is make the CPU's battles visible. Otherwise, whenever two CPU-controlled warlords fight, you're gonna get stuck watching an endlessly long battle between the two. And I couldn't find any way to get it to stop either. Battles are unfortunately rather simple and very slow. You only have one type of unit, but you can attack enemies in two different fashions. Just sort of attack them outright or set fire to the square where they're sitting on. Probably the most unusual feature is you need to bring rice with you to battle, and if you run out, you lose the battle. Or if your rice supply gets captured, you lose. And once you put the rice down, it can't be moved because apparently supply wagons hadn't been invented yet in 2nd century China or something. In that particular battle, one of the generals was Lu Bu, who was one of the major badasses in the book, and supposedly one of the major badasses in Chinese history. Also, the battles move very slowly. The camera has to crawl around the battlefield from the front lines to your base where your rice is kept, so you can hit pass on the unit defending the rice. Same is true for the enemy, so there's just a lot of dead time watching enemy units pass on their turn. Romance of the Three Kingdoms isn't quite a classic 4X style strategy game. There's no exploration really, no resources to collect other than rice. You need to spend some money improving your territories and keeping your generals loyal and your population happy, but the information isn't always displayed in a helpful way. The main map won't tell you which territories belong to who, for example, other than through color coding. And there's not a key to that on the map screen, so you sort of have to look up who's who on the map screen or write it down or just try to remember it. But this is certainly an important game. Koei built pretty much their entire empire on it, and the strategy game mania hitting the Famicom in 1988 can be traced back directly to this. But for those who have been spoiled by Civilization games or other modern strategy games, you might find it just a little bit too unpolished. Natsumi. Oh really? This is the first game we've seen from Natsumi, who would later go on to greater things, such as Harvest Moon, Lufia, and the Pocky and Rocky games. I don't know if this is literally their first game, but it's definitely the first published console game. One thing I'll say right off the bat, Touhou Kenbun Roku has some of the most interesting music we've seen. We'll discuss one particular piece of music later, but for now check out all the wacky sci-fi sounds during the intro. This is one of those nutty Japanese games that mixes up sci-fi and history and then throws in a healthy dose of surreal humor to make a deliberately goofy game. This guy from futuristic Japan gets sent back to the year 1275 and meets Marco Polo. The game's title, the name, Touhou Kenbun Roku, is what the book, The Adventures of Marco Polo, is called in Japan. Though the game does not actually resemble Marco Polo's real-life travels at all, as far as I can tell, the game's box describes it as a new wave psychedelic adventure. Here we have some more examples of the game's musical pastiche of different styles. Touhou Kenbun Roku has a very similar idea to last episode's Erika Tosa Toru game. There are two characters, Marco and Bunroko, and you switch between them from time to time. It's not a new idea, but I guess it adds a bit of character to the game. And it probably needs it because the game's appeal is going to have to be based on the character and the story, because the gameplay uses the same completely typical look, talk, and move pattern found in just about every other Japanese adventure game of the time. It is sort of disappointing that Japanese adventure games all adhere so closely to this style. If you look like a random handful of Western adventure games of this period, say Police Quest, Maniac Mansion, and Deja Vu, they're all completely different in how they play and look. But for the Famicom, an adventure game, whether it's from Nintendo, Namco, or Natsumi, they all look just about the same. Now here's the password screen. It's cool that it uses bugs and shells and eyeballs instead of letters, but check out the music. It's a Hebrew song called Mayim Mayim, which apparently most younger Japanese folks at the time would have been exposed to in school. The tune was later used in Konami's shoot-'em-up Sexy Parodius, and that version became the basis for an incredible number of mashup videos based on the song. For example, or on the other hand we have this. Seriously, if you go to YouTube or Nico Nico and look up Mayim Mayim, you'll find tons of these things, most of which are very annoying. What's the deal with this song? Who knows? But Touhou Kenbun Roku was perhaps the first game to actually use this song. No, if nothing else, it was ahead of its time in that regard. Now we've got 3 games on November 11th, all of them sort of terrible. First up is one from SNK, who are still on their pre-Neo Geo rut of crappy games, and it's called Touchdown Fever. Like some earlier SNK games, this was released by KAC in Japan, and then later by SNK themselves in the United States. So this would be the second American football game for the Famicom, the other being 10 Yard Fight. But don't fear, football fans, we have a much better football game coming up in the next few months. Like so many of the SNK Famicom games, this was originally an arcade title, one which used some pretty nifty speech samples. Sports games really seemed like speech samples, I've noticed. The arcade game used button mashing to make your player run, and a weird football-shaped joystick to move and throw the ball around. I don't think it was a huge hit, but SNK naturally ported it to the Famicom and NES anyway. You start off choosing from several pro football teams which are identified only by their city names. Here's the kickoff. SNK couldn't be bothered to draw a shadow on the ball while it's in the air. It's been pointed out that the field is huge compared to the players. It takes them about a second to run 1 yard, which means they run at about, what, maybe 2 miles per hour? So these guys must be like really tiny. You have a few different play options to choose from, but these aren't really formations. The offense and defense just sort of lined up randomly each play. Now passing is difficult because the other team can intercept passes very easily. Touchdown Fever doesn't really seem to factor in the altitude of the ball, so a pass can be intercepted by someone when it really should be sailing way over their heads. The running options are probably your best bet. I couldn't really figure out how to use any sort of logic or strategy in this game. The whole thing actually confused me to no end. I'm not even sure what the Japanese name of this game is. The box says American Football in huge letters, but the title screen simply says Touchdown Fever. So it's definitely the worst football game we've seen so far. This wasn't released in the US until 1991, so it had already been rendered obsolete by better games before it even hit the shelves. Released the same day as Touchdown Fever is Gambler Jiko Chuushinha, the first Famicom game from Asmic. Looks like that logo is flipping me off. Hey, that looks kinda like the octopus from the Parodius games. You may have seen some of the other names on the title screen, Game Arts and Yellowhorn. Game Arts are the guys behind Thexter, and Yellowhorn is just some obscure development company who I don't even know anything about. The port was apparently done by Bits Laboratory, who specialized in porting computer games to the Famicom, and also worked on the Famicom version of Dexter. This is actually a rather striking and vibrant opening, though I don't really understand this squiggle below his sunglasses. Is that supposed to be his nose? Couldn't be his mouth. But either way, I like the big thick black lines used in drawing the character. So guess what? This is a Mahjong game, one with a lot of characters. Before you start the game, you get this lengthy character roll call. It just goes on and on. Whoa, is that the Terminator? Naturally, this is based on a manga from the 1980s, which never seems to have received an animated version, and doesn't seem very well remembered today. Regardless, there were a lot of Mahjong video games based on the character, starting with a Japanese computer game. Here's the MSX version. Pretty much the same opening. The Famicom version was given a bit of a graphic makeover, but this MSX version is pretty much the same as the one we're looking at today. Now the Famicom one has 3 game options, including a story mode. I believe the object here is to defeat each of the other characters in Mahjong games, and uses a password save system. As I've said before, there were tons of Mahjong games released in Japan, and these are going to be difficult to cover since I don't really understand the rules very well, and this game is apparently based on an even more difficult variation of Mahjong. This looks just like the typical Mahjong video games of the time, though it seems to have some sort of auto-play mode, since the game started sort of choosing tiles for me all by itself. After this, plenty more Gambler Jiko Chuushinha games came out on various systems, right up through the PlayStation era. Here's one of the very last for the Saturn. All the women are drawn with the same blank stare and open mouth. It's kinda creepy looking. And there are way more characters to choose from, but the game itself looks like just a regular old Mahjong game. In fact, it doesn't even really seem that different from the Famicom game. I guess they decided not to mess with a successful formula. Well, that's Gambler Jiko Chuushinha for ya. Since we've now officially reached the Japanese holiday video game rush, expect to see a lot more of this kind of thing in the next few episodes. Alright, we're going deep into obscure Japanese game territory here. Jalico makes its first of 2 appearances today with Saiyuuki World. Saiyuuki sounds familiar. Was that song by Kyu Sakamoto? No wait, Saiyuuki is the Japanese title for the Chinese novel that we call Journey to the West. So we've got 2 games today based on classic Chinese novels. Now you might recall another Saiyuuki game, Super Monkey Daiboken, the worst Famicom game of all time. Or at least, that we've seen so far. Well, Saiyuuki World sort of doesn't plumb those depths, but let's take a look. Looks like a standard walk and stab game. Character is based on Sengoku, it seems. You have a status and inventory screen, where you can see all your equipment, items collected, money, and so on. This guy gives you a sword, or rather a little tiny knife. You can now kill enemies and pick up some gold. And you'll often be entering buildings and talking to people. Lots of shops to buy armor and items. So far this looks pretty typical, but I can't help but feel this somehow looks familiar. Not just generally speaking, but I think I've played this game before. Let's see. Oh yes, Wonder Boy in Monsterland, the arcade game from Sega and West 1, ported to the Sega Master System. Saiyuuki World is not dissimilar to that game, it's pretty much an exact copy, right down to the enemy sprites. It looks like Jalico just took the game and just changed the character sprites. The thing was, this is actually the second time this has happened. Bikuriman World was a launch title on the PC Engine. Hudson had licensed the rights for the game from West 1, but altered all the characters. So did Jalico do the same thing? Did they pay West 1 for the game, or were they just perpetrating the most blatant game ripoff ever? If so, why didn't they get sued? Or maybe they did, who knows? And why is NMK's name on the title screen? What do they have to do with this? Sadly, I really couldn't find much info as to how Saiyuuki World came to be, so I can't really answer the whole rip-off or licensed game question. If this is a rip-off, it's pretty amazing. Either way, both the PC Engine game and the Master System game look much better than this, so there's real no need to actually try to play Saiyuuki World. Let's fire up the FDS here. And we have Samurai Sword. I know it sounds like a fighting game, such as Samurai Showdown or Bushido Blade, but it's not. It is, however, one of the very few FDS games from Capcom. And we also have a great English translation by Mute. So, this guy named Sauron, is causing all sorts of trouble, and only one guy can stop him. Wait, I have to stop Sauron? We'll see about that. Samurai Sword throws you right in the action, with like an RPG style battle. Though it's one of those battles that you can't actually win. I'm sure you've seen those before in RPGs. Pretty gripping stuff here. Sauron certainly sort of looks like your standard RPG-type villain. Wait, now you need a light mage? Well anyway, it turns out the game is actually a traditional Japanese adventure game. Though one with pretty high production values. You look around and find some elves who are so small they can fit in your hand. Those are some really small elves. Maybe they're really fairies or something. The normal action commands appear, look and move and so on. If you walk around, the only thing you can really interact with is this bar in the middle of the woods. I can't imagine they get much business. Talk to them and they'll tell you they lost their key, which is conveniently lying around on the ground nearby. Pretty simple, but after you give them back the key, nothing really happens, until you have to commit one specific action, in order to break them out of the pattern of repeating the same dialogue over and over again. So just randomly start using commands until you happen to reach the take the liquor option, and then they'll start talking again. You'll also learn that liquor makes elves friendly. Okay. Which brings us to a problem with Samurai Sword and other Japanese adventure games. There's an extreme linearity imposed. Here, for example, you find a hole in a tree and a bird. You scare away the bird, but there's nothing to be found afterwards. When you examine it, it says there's nothing unusual. In fact, the Elf King is missing and trapped here, but he doesn't actually appear until you give the elves the liquor and they tell you the king is missing. Then, and only then, does he magically appear by the tree or the hole. Every interaction has to be done in a certain predetermined order. This makes the game very illogical. Moving on, you'll encounter a giant beetle in a cave. There are occasional battles in Samurai Sword, but there's always only one way to beat them. Here you have to use magic to damage the beetle's shell, and then slow him down using another magic spell. Your companion girl has various magic spells, which change depending on the situation. Here, Bolt appears, so use that to kill the beetle. And again, the game sort of leads you down a particular path, there's not much choice involved. Samurai Sword feels a lot like Princess Tomato and Salad Kingdom or Ripple Island, since there are discrete levels which you handle in a particular order. You can't backtrack to earlier areas, and you can't move forward until you've completed certain tasks. There's a section where you need to revive a weary traveler on the road by giving him water, just like you did Percy in Princess Tomato, though this guy doesn't follow you around afterwards, he just dies. I wouldn't call Samurai Sword a difficult game, but you can die if you don't perform the correct actions. You need to run from the zombie, or it will instantly kill you by hugging you to death. That's not normally how zombies kill folks. So both the zombies and the elves in this game are kind of weird. And for that matter, why is it even called Samurai Sword? It doesn't appear to take place in Japan, and your character isn't a samurai as far as I know. I think there's an actual Samurai Sword weapon later in the game. So it's just another standard adventure game, though a reasonably nice looking one. Nothing too interesting aside from Capcom's name on it. The holiday season is going to bring out a number of new publishers. We have 3 this episode: Natsume, Asmic, and now Athena, who are probably best known for the Dezaemon games, which are those shoot-'em-up creator games. Family Quiz, however, is just a plain old minigame collection based around trivia questions. So, again with the bunny girls, what is Japan's obsession with girls in bunny suits? We just saw one in Gambler Jiko Chuushinha. You choose how many players, up to 4, difficulty, and game type. The first game is like a standard game show setup. The first person to hit the buzzer can answer the question, though the answers take a second to display, so you can't hit the buzzer too quickly. If you do answer correctly, your chair will be lifted up along the wall, and the first one to the top wins. The next game is basically Othello. You answer a question correctly, and you can put a piece down. The object, of course, just like real Othello, is to surround your opponents. And then we have the sort of very simple board game. Answering correctly will win you a dice spin, and you try to get to the center of the board. And finally, we have a memory game. So there's really nothing special or interesting going on here, it's just another quickie from a tiny publisher. The game is only around 130 kilobytes, so it's a really small cart by 1988 standards. They probably could have squeezed it onto the FDS. Hey, guess what time it is? Time for another Chrontendo special feature, in this case the 1988 Arcade Roundup, in the fine tradition of the 1987 Arcade Roundup from Chrontendo episode 24. 1987 introduced arcade titles such as Contra, Double Dragon, and R-Type, all enormously influential and beloved games. 1988 has plenty of cool games, but nothing quite as genre-defining as those I just mentioned. As before, this is certainly not every arcade game released this year, but it does cover the big hits, the important games, in my opinion, as well as various representative titles. So let's start with our old buddy Sega and their Altered Beast, the first game for furries. It's a pre-Renegade single-plane beat-em-up with one special gimmick. You collect power-ups which alter your physical appearance. You get bigger and beefier, eventually transforming you into a super powerful half-human, half-animal creature. It's one of the more well-known Sega games from 1988, probably due to its Genesis port being a pack-in game for that console for a little while. Not as well known, but still very awesome, is Wonder Boy 3 Monster Lair, designed by West 1. It sits sort of halfway between Wonder Boy and Monsterland in terms of gameplay and general style. It loses Monsterland's RPG elements and instead tosses in some shoot-'em-up sequences. Overall, the game is very fun and visually very appealing. One of the better Sega games we're going to see this episode. On the other hand, Galaxy Force is one of the lesser-known entries in Sega's Super Scalar 3D games. In fact, it's almost completely forgotten compared to stuff like Space Harrier or Afterburner. It does look a lot like Afterburner in space, I suppose. But look at this. It's just like Gradius 2. Yeah, this part is pretty cool. Better remembered today is Power Drift. Pretty decent go-kart racing game, which is sort of like Outrun on steroids. Lots of impressive sprite-based 3D effects, and the tracks have lots of twists and turns, hills, and all kinds of surprises. Sega has really added a vertical element to the game, as opposed to just horizontal. Just like Galaxy Force 2, it's one impressive-looking game. So it was a solid year for Sega, but nothing really that innovative or special came out of it. Moving on to Konami, in 1988 they released a sequel to their 1985 classic shoot-'em-up. Gradius 2, called Vulcan Venture in some areas, gives you choices of different kinds of weapons and shields, and it introduces the wonderful Pulse Laser. Gradius 2 is a huge graphic upgrade to the first game. Check out the giant fire serpents. This would have blown the minds of Gradius fans the first time they played this. And bosses are also much more interesting. And it's still stupidly hard, however, even much more so than the first Gradius. Another Konami sequel here.
What is this place? Keep your eyes peeled.
Yep, Super Contra, much more over-the-top sequel to 1987's huge hit Contra. This introduces the Contra traditions of really flashy weapons and huge explosions. It also ditched those 3D-like hallway sections of Contra. Is it better than the first game? I don't know, but it's certainly louder and more frenetic. And another sequel, 88 Games, the Track and Field sequel that is completely different than Track and Field 2 released for the Famicom and NES. Konami just loves speech samples at this time. It's really just Track and Field with upgraded graphics, some new events, and much uglier characters. The main event is, not surprisingly, a wrestling game, though not officially based on the WWF main event TV show that was very popular at this time. The look and feel is clearly inspired by WWF wrestling, however. And again, there's lots of speech samples, and the game engine was later used for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the first game. So Konami seemed to sort of focus on bigger and better sequels in 1988. Taito was still pumping out tons of arcade games in '88, despite, in my opinion, gradually diminishing relevance. Check this out, how does he take off his pants? Superman is yet another single-plane beat-em-up, though you can fly, meaning you can move up and down on the screen at will. It's not a great game, but it's interesting since there weren't a whole lot of comic book superhero games at this time. Now check out this intro. Good lord. It's gotta be the most gruesome video game intro ever. How could they even get away with that? Kabuki Z is a bizarre weapons-based beat-em-up that you've probably never heard of. It does have Renegade-style multiplane action, however. Also, your character can move around while kneeling, which looks really awkward. It's a bizarre game. And speaking of bizarre, it's Kageki, one of the ugliest-looking fighting games of all time, this side of the Pit Fighter. And man, look at those gigantic heads. One-on-one fighting games are not too common at this time, and games like Kageki show you why. The fighting is very button-mashy, and has very little in common with later Capcom and SNK games. And just like Kabuki Z, the whole thing sort of seems really weird somehow. Ah yes, the Middle Eastern terrorists, a common boogeyman in mid-1980s. Hey, I see the Mediterranean. This is Operation Thunderbolt, the sequel to Operation Wolf. Throws in some sequences where you move forward rather than just side to side. Rather distastefully, this is named after a real-life military action, in which an Israeli strike team went to Uganda to rescue hostages whose jet had been hijacked. That was a real classy move, Taito. So Taito goes for the sprite-based 3D with Enforce, one of the first games on their fancy new Taito Z board, also used for Continental Circus and Chase HQ. I guess you'd call this a rail shooter. And your weapon on the right looks like the chain gun from Wolfenstein 3D. Like so many other games that we're seeing today, you can really see the industry sort of moving towards 3D games. Still pretty impressive looking. Now on the other side of the fence, technologically speaking, we have Chuka Tyson, sometimes called Cloudmaster, a rather old-fashioned shoot-'em-up by 1988 standards. It does have cool background, dribbling like traditional Chinese paintings. It just seems somehow not very special compared to something like Gradius 2. They'll both have giant fire-themed bosses. Perhaps the most fondly remembered Taito game of 1988 was New Zealand Story. Another adorable game in the Bubble Bobble Rainbow Island style. You play as a little Kiwi rescuing his friends from a walrus. New Zealand Story was ported to many different systems, and we'll definitely encounter this game later on. Capcom also gets all sequel happy with Ghouls and Ghosts, the sequel to their pioneering 1985 platformer Ghosts and Goblins. Great intro here, Princess Prin Prin is kidnapped again, and it's basically just the same awesomeness of the first game. Plus a few new things like armor upgrades and a magician that turns into a helpless old man, which really sucks when that happens to you. Check out these cool wind effects and physics. It's a gorgeous looking game, and also really hard, as you would expect from those sadistic bastards at Capcom. So Capcom is definitely behind Konami in the speech sample department. Forgotten Worlds is the follow-up to Sidearms, both being horizontal shoot-'em-ups that allow you to reverse face at will and shoot in either direction. And of course we have the RPG elements tossed in, like shops to buy power-ups. Not a huge classic, but still a reasonably cool game nonetheless. A lot less interesting was their vertical shooter, Last Duel. Capcom also released a new version of 1943 this year, and some sort of generic games like Capcom Bowling. Overall, Ghouls and Ghosts was Capcom's big highlight of 1988. And speaking of shoot-'em-ups, Image Fight was Irem's 1988 entry in the genre. It's a pretty decent game with weapons pods similar to R-Type's, but a bit disappointing after the overall incredible awesomeness that was R-Type. Next year, Irem released X Multiply, so Image Fight is bookended by two much more interesting games. Irem also released Vigilante that year, which we looked at Chrontendo Episode 6, but really nothing else very interesting. Kind of a quiet year for Irem. Now, do you know who had a busy year? Namco. Most notoriously with Splatterhouse, one of the first really gruesome horror-themed arcade games. You play as some poor dude stuck in a haunted house and possessed by a demonic hockey mask. Clearly inspired by Jason from Friday the 13th. You can do stuff like pick up a meat cleaver and whack the heads off monsters and reanimate corpses. Also notable is the minimalistic, gloomy music. There's really all kinds of icky stuff in this game. Splatterhouse is definitely the goriest, slimiest, and most horrific arcade game in existence in 1988. Now, Namco had just released the 16-bit Namco System 1 in '87, and later in the year they debuted the System 2 with Final Lap. This board was capable of sprite rotation, stretching, and so on, much like the later Super NES. Cyber Ninja is not a very interesting game, but it does employ a few weird sprite effects. Now, Assault is again not the greatest game ever, but definitely shows off the System 2's sprite handling capabilities. According to Wikipedia, it was the first game ever to use something called, quote, massive sprite rotation. You can do a lot of stuff like this. It also had a double joystick tank-like control. Ordyne is almost like a shoot-'em-up version of Forgotten Worlds. It's a horizontal shooter with an RPG elements. Like so many games this episode, it's really not that well remembered today, but it certainly does surprise you with a few interesting things. Like its rotation effects when this boss is going down here. Or this section right here where you sort of have to navigate through this maze of background objects. Our final entry in the Namco shows off its new board category is Philios. Another game that you probably haven't played. It's a Greek mythology themed vertical shooter, but its frequently moving, rotating, and resizing backgrounds are pretty impressive. Now, later in the year, Namco released something called the System 21, their first board that produced a polygon-based 3D. A 1988 racing game called Winning Run used the System 21, but this is sadly not yet emulated, and you can't even find footage of this game on YouTube. It's virtually a lost game at the moment. But Namco definitely has the technological advantage among Japanese game manufacturers this year. Now let's switch gears and take a look at the American arcade scene. Atari Games is probably the dominant force at this time. Vindicators is a pretty simple top-down tank game which uses some digitized graphics, much like 1987's Blasteroids. It also has tank controls, much like Assault. Overall though, it's not particularly noteworthy. Now Cyberball, on the other hand, is a futuristic football game. It had a unique 4-player cabinet with dual screens. The players are all robots, and the ball can actually explode while you're holding it. And just like Vindicators, not really many folks remember it fondly today. Now, Atari's main achievement at this time was something called hard driving. This was notable for being the second ever polygon-based 3D arcade game, the first being Atari's iRobot, which incredibly came out back in 1983. And while this is not very exciting to look at today, this would have been quite unique and striking in 1988. Hard driving, along with Namco's winning run, officially initiated the 3D era in arcades. As we'll see in the 1988 Computer Game Roundup, 3D games are slowly making their way to the homes as well. Oh yes, and let's not forget, Atari released a little game called Tetris into arcades in 1988. This was of course originally a 1985 game released for Soviet computers. It reached home computers in the US in 1987, and in 1988 it hit the arcades. Atari would release an NES version through Tengen in 1989, which, as you may have heard, caused a wee bit of a dust-up between Nintendo and Tengen. We'll hear more about that later, however. But guess who also released a Tetris arcade game? Sega. Yep, and theirs wasn't as good as Atari's. I'm not sure either version caused too much excitement in the arcades, but this was of course the calm before the Tetris storm of 1989. Williams, who was once a big-time arcade player, didn't release much of interest in '88 beyond Narc. Take a look at that guy. Designed by Eugene Jarvis of Defender and Robotron fame, Narc is a charmingly reactionary game, in which you play as some sort of government-sanctioned vigilante, on a mission to simply kill every drug dealer you happen to see on the street. Like Atari, Williams was experimenting with digitized graphics, so we can sort of see a gulf opening up between the aesthetic sensibilities of Western and Japanese game manufacturers. Elsewhere, the US arcade game was not really too hot. Lots of undistinguished sports games, such as Magic Johnson's Fast Break from Arcadia. Anybody remember this game? Probably not. Or John Elway's Team Quarterback from Leland. The era of celebrity athletes putting their names on video games was just slowly dawning at this point. This looks a lot like Cyberball, only with worse graphics and without the robots. Back in Japan, there were a number of interesting games from smaller manufacturers. Cabal from TAD Corporation was a rather unique shooter. It resembled a light gun game, though it was controlled with a joystick, and you moved your character in the crosshairs at the same time. And despite the fact that your character was some sort of super military tough guy, he did this dance after beating each level. Yeah, and lots of on-screen objects were destructible. Walls, buildings, everything. Overall, it was a pretty cool game. UPL came out with a horizontal shooter called Atomic Robo-Kid. The Robo-Kid himself is inconveniently large and chunky, but fortunately hitting enemies doesn't actually kill you, it just slows you down some. Also, you could face either direction, like in Sidearms or Forgotten World. While it's not the best looking game ever, it did have a cool sort of biomechanical feel to it. Technos Japan was becoming the go-to guys for beat-em-ups at this time, and naturally they whipped out a sequel to their monster hit of 1987, Double Dragon. A Double Dragon sequel sure sounds like a good idea, but for some reason Technos reworked the control scheme, making it very unintuitive and hard to use. It was a shame because we would have liked to have seen a good sequel to Double Dragon. I guess if you can get used to the controls, it's not that bad. Now SNK, a company that produced so many great games in the 1990s, were still really not doing very much. A typical game was Fighting Soccer. A soccer game which looks just like all the other soccer games. And even does that thing where the ball gets really big as it flies through the air and sort of moves towards the camera. On a more positive note, Tecmo enters the beat-em-up field with Ninja Gaiden, the arcade game. Ninja in the USA. The title screen says it all. For those of you who only know the NES game, the original arcade Ninja Gaiden was very different. It was real beat-em-up-y, as opposed to being platformy. Though it did have lots of destructible and interactable objects in the background, it also had the greatest ever continue screen. That is really cool. And lastly, Data East produced a few notable games. They were heavily into military-themed games, so we get stuff like Bloody Wolf, which is like Commando with a 3/4 isometric viewpoint. It was also very similar to Data East's earlier Heavy Barrel. It's all about killing guys and rescuing hostages. And it's also known for having some pretty bad English dialogue. And of course, we cannot forget this one. Rampant ninja-related crimes. And President Ronnie has been kidnapped by ninjas. Of course, it's Bad Dudes versus the Dragon Ninja. Whoever came up with that title is a genius. And it's not a bad little beat 'em up. Better than Irem's Vigilante. And is that Karnov? It does have some cool stuff, like a level on top of moving trucks. And finally, here's a game I should have mentioned last episode, Cobra Command. Not the original arcade game, not the NES Cobra Command, but a standard horizontal shoot-'em up that takes place in a helicopter. I believe this came out either around the same time or slightly after the console Cobra Command. So Data East delivers, I guess, some solid, if not exactly exciting video games here. Well, that wraps up 1988 in a nutshell. Please keep your eyes peeled for the upcoming 1988 Computer Roundup. And now, let's return to the Famicom. It's time for some Namco with Kaijuu Monogatari, which means roughly Shell Creature's Story, though the box art says Shell Soar's Story. Soars like dinosaurs, I guess? Who knows? The guy on the left looks disturbingly naked, in my opinion. Published by Namco, developed by Birthday, an obscure little Japanese company that I really know nothing about. Oh, by the way, on the left is the text speed. You'll want to set it to fast, trust me. We get a lengthy introductory sequence, but let's actually take a look at King Mike's translation. I'll warn you though, Kaijuu Monogatari is one of those games that makes no sense, even in English. The plot seems pretty much in the Square and Final Fantasy style. The harmony of the world has been disturbed, and shell creatures have elemental properties: earth, wind, fire, and water. The bad guy is unfortunately called Fat Badger, not very scary sounding. This opening does have a cool effect where Fat Badger sort of appears and disappears for a split second. Hope you're watching this on the 60 frames per second version. So the heroes battle Fat Badger and get scattered to the ends of the earth. You need to get them back together and defeat the Badger. The king tells you there's rumors of other shell creatures in other parts of the world. How fast do rumors travel around this place? We saw the shell creatures fighting Fat Badger just a minute ago. Maybe your heroes have been dicking around for a few months after fighting Fat Badger? I don't know. So, Kaijuu Monogatari is very much in the Dragon Quest mode. In fact, this is the first RPG from Namco that's clearly inspired by Dragon Quest. Almost everything in this game is derived directly from Enix's RPG. The shops in town sell various items, which will become important later. The sake, yeah, don't bother buying any right now. And the pharmacy sells a canteen, which you might want to grab. Not sure why a pharmacy would be selling a canteen, but there you go. Then we have some treasure chests, which are tantalizingly out of reach. But if you start talking to people, you'll find this guy who wants some water, like maybe water in a canteen. Give him the canteen and he'll move, allowing you to get at the chests. But go for the chest and hey, it's locked. Certain chests and doors require keys, which naturally disappear out of your inventory when you use them. I don't know who invented the disposable key in RPGs, but whoever it was, I hate that guy. Also very important is the poison poppy, as we'll see later. So first things first, go out and get some experience in gold, or pearls, as they call them in this game. Combat is initially, in my opinion, very unbalanced. Unlike Dragon Quest slimes, the bats and slugs, which often combine in groups of two, have just way too many hit points, and the battles are just a war of attrition. You just wear the enemy down, and they wear you down, but because you only have 14 hit points, there's about a 50-50 chance you'll die. If you survive, you'll have about 1 or 2 hit points left, so you have to hightail it back to the inn and spend 5 pearls. So reaching level 2 is pretty painful. It's quite easy to get your butt kicked even right outside the first castle. You can try to escape, but this works maybe 50% of the time. Naturally, you'll then need to buy better weapons and armor, which takes quite a while. But once you get to level 3 or 4, you'll be able to venture out a bit. The world is sort of spread out, with little in the way of landmarks. Makes it kind of hard to navigate, actually. But you'll encounter little caves and such, which almost always require a silver key. That's right, the disposable silver keys, either that or a canteen or the sake. So you head back to the castle to buy the item, and then head back out to the cave or whatever, and you're going to talk to a guy who gives you a map or something. So here is Kaijuu Monogatari's one original idea. In most RPGs such as Dragon Quest II, you encounter other party members and they join your party. Here, however, if you open up your menu, see there's an option there called Pass. Hitting that will switch you to the next party member, who is talking to a different king, who also gives you 50 pearls and a heartstone, and you're also at level 1. Normally the first part in an RPG is the roughest going, where you have to fight basic enemies over and over, heal a lot, and then slowly and painfully become powerful enough to survive in the overworld for more than a minute. And then the real game begins. Kaijuu Monogatari, however, makes you do this 4 times. Yes, you've got to separately level up each party member from scratch and then find the other members. And each character starts in their own separate town, which are pretty much identical to all the other towns in the world. So it's sort of like Dragon Quest IV, only really lame. The game takes the most grueling, repetitive part of an old school RPG and makes you repeat it 4 times. Great job, guys! And there's very little variety, as each character has different stats and uses some magic, but really it's not a big difference. Generally speaking, your first goal is to trade in the heartstone you start out with for a map, and the maps are really not very useful at this point. You'll encounter various villages, towns. It's pretty non-linear, though you are limited by your strength or your wealth. For example, no way would you have enough money to make the boat ride this early in the game. And you probably never heard of this game until today, but it actually did spawn a series, though later games were published by Hudson. Sequels appeared on the Game Boy and the Super Famicom. One of them was Dai Kaijuu Monogatari, seen here. It was never the most high-tech or well-known RPG series, but someone must have been buying them, because they kept making the games. Anyway, eventually you will encounter these passages guarded by goblins, which link the game's various areas together, and this is where the sake is needed. Strangely, if you have a random enemy encounter in this passage, you'll get these weird sequences on a chessboard-like floor where you fight multiple battles. And then you can finally reach the area where another character is, and if you get them together, they can join forces. In this case, it gives you a special magic spell called Magma, that uses magic points from both characters. Note here that both characters are poisoned. One completely hateful thing about this game is the way you frequently get poisoned. The poison poppy is used to cure poison, but your inventory is extremely limited. You have like 5 inventory slots at first. So it's not like Final Fantasy where you can walk around with 10 poison cures. More like 1 or 2 maximum. And then it gets worse, because getting poison causes you to constantly lose health, but also it lowers your strength, making battles damn near impossible. Your main hero, who has no healing magic, is pretty much screwed if he gets poisoned and doesn't have the poison poppy. In other words, poisoning really sucks in this game. So what we have here is a game with a very interesting and fresh approach to multiple characters, but the characters have no personality or backstory. The combat is too repetitive and doesn't really make much sense. Kupi has some magic attacks, but they always seem to do the exact same damage as his physical attacks. So what's the point of magic then? And there aren't any fancy elemental properties like in Final Fantasy. Casting ice on a fire monster does the same damage as hitting them with your own sword. And even the special magma spell is kinda lame. So it's a cool idea, but ends up being a completely unpolished game. Another FDS game from Konami Gyruss, or maybe Gyruss, or maybe it's named after the Greek sandwich and is Gyruss. The Japanese version has this long, crazy text scroll, which probably tells the story of an alien invasion and how the fate of the world is resting on one pilot. Ooh, I bet that's him. In the US, Konami released it on a cartridge under the Ultra Games label. There's a much shorter plot description, and the music, JS Box, Toccata, and Fugue in D minor, sounds a little different. And by the way, despite being the most familiar piece of music with Bach's name on it, a lot of musical scholars don't think that Bach actually wrote it. That progress screen is also something new to the US version. Yep, you go to Neptune first, then Pluto, which sounds wrong, but every so often Pluto is closer to the Sun than Neptune, due to Pluto's weird orbit. As we see here, Gyruss is what we would call a tube shooter, similar to the classic game Tempest. That is, you move in a circle, shooting at enemies that are moving up and down an interior surface of an imaginary tube shape. Now, Gyruss is a pretty old game, to be getting a port in 1988, since it was released to arcades in 1983, which was several generations ago in 1980's arcade game terms. A cool looking game due to the enemy ship's movement patterns, but it suffered from having a joystick rather than a dial controller like Tempest. Now, Gyruss had already been released to many platforms by 1984, such as the 2600, ColecoVision, and the Commodore 64, so this is an odd choice for Konami to be suddenly revisiting in 1988. But hell, they released an updated version for the Xbox Live Arcade a few years ago, so why not? I guess they like the game. So anyway, you shoot enemies as they fly around, dodge any projectiles that come at you, occasionally get a boring power-up. After a couple levels, you'll get a boss battle. You do have a limited use charged up shot that is fired with the A button. These come in handy for some bosses. As mentioned, the arcade Gyruss did not use a rotary controller, and obviously this version uses the D-pad. But there are two controller settings. The one I'm using here moves you towards the 12 o'clock position when you hit up on the D-pad, and the 3 o'clock position when you move right, and so on. The other control option is more rotary-like. Hitting left or right moves you clockwise or counterclockwise. Unlike the other control schemes, you don't stop when you reach 12 or 3 or 9 or 6, you just keep moving around and around. So you can't get stuck at one of these points. And that's pretty much the way it is. Gyruss is a simple game. One notable thing is that the original was designed by Yoshiki Okamoto, who left Konami for Capcom and designed such games as 1942, Gunsmoke, Forgotten Worlds, and was later involved in Resident Evil. He's still active, perhaps the most well-known recent game of his is Folklore. And this is, I believe, the last FDS game from Konami. More FDS games here. This time from the frequently disappointing Data East. And don't get your hopes up now because this is a Pachinko game. Pachinko Grand Prix, or Pachinko GP. Data East can't seem to decide what to call this game. Still, it's worth pointing out that the expectations of quality for Famicom games has reached the point where even something like this has pretty decent art on the title screen and a decent little tune. So it's a Grand Prix game in the sense that you're racing from city to city, but doing so by playing Pachinko as opposed to driving cars. I'm surprised she's not wearing bunny ears. As you will recall, the Pachinko game is one where you put ball bearings into a machine in hopes of winning more ball bearings. And this is totally not a form of gambling, but in reality it is. Pachinko games often let you examine the peg configuration up close. I don't really know what for. I guess this helps you plan your Pachinko strategy, but I really have no idea how. When you start, you'll use the D-pad to increase or decrease the pressure of the ball bearing shooter thingy. Hitting right will increase the pressure and left will decrease it. The ball bearings come out, hit the little wheels and doohickeys, and then you win more balls. You start with 100 and try to end up with 1000 before the timer runs out. Occasionally it'll hit something and the whole business will start flashing and you'll win more bearings. If you beat the clock, you'll move on to the next machine, and so on. This one has a slot machine-like mechanism built in, something which is apparently quite popular in modern Pachinko games, I understand. I guess this is like a cultural thing, since Pachinko games strike me as being like a combination of luck and inaction. Most of the time you don't really have to do anything, just watch the ball bearings pile up. If that's not happening, then adjust the pressure a little bit until it does. Maybe there's really some kind of arcane skill to Pachinko, but to me, this is really sort of like watching a video game play itself, with no sort of real reward. And now for a completely different type of adventure game. It's a port of ICOM's Deja Vu, with a nifty new musical theme. This console version was released in both Japan and the US by Kemco, but if they were the guys who actually ported this to the Famicom, I have no idea. This is perhaps the only NES game to begin in a bathroom stall. Deja Vu is an American point-and-click adventure game, one of the original point-and-click adventure games, so we can sort of compare this to something like Samurai Sword, and we'll get an idea of how US and Japanese adventure games tend to differ. There's quite a bit of narration in Deja Vu. Just like Space Quest, the narrator uses sort of a detached, kind of ironic tone. For example, when you examine the toilet paper. Most of the narration is taken directly from the original computer game, released on the Macintosh in 1985. We've already seen that version a couple times in Chrontendo before, so let's take a look at the Amiga version, which is quite similar to the Mac version, though it's in full color. Now, the huge innovation in Deja Vu was using the mouse, and using a windowed setup that pretty much resembled the Mac's and Amiga's operating systems. The result was quite a bit of ease when it comes to playing it. To examine something, you simply click on it. To walk through a door, click either on the doorway or the corresponding box in the mini-map on the right-hand side of the screen. You could use the verb list to interact with items. Also, the game had really great writing and some creepy death scenes, but very little music. For the home version, music was added to the entire game, which was nice, but the interface had to be completely reworked, which turned out to be not so nice. You still have the verb list, but the inventory window has been replaced with a notebook listing all the items you have, and you can no longer drag and drop items into the inventory. Deja Vu is mostly an inventory-based game. The game world itself is pretty small, and there's not too much interaction with other people. And most of the game is spent finding items and then using them in the expected ways. For example, you'll always be finding keys used to unlock doors. Now, this is no Sierra game, but there are still a few ways to lose. Choosing the wrong option when you encounter an alligator will kill you, which is really not that surprising when you think about it, though the creepy skulls from the computer version have been replaced with a tombstone. But unlike the computer versions, dying will just take you back to a continue option, which will put you a screen or two before where you got killed. So really dying is no big deal. In fact, it's fun to mess around whenever a dangerous situation arises. Other ways to lose are getting shot by muggers, or randomly shooting people on the street. This will get you instantly arrested. Or walking into the police station before you've solved the game's mysteries. Surprisingly, the death by suicide option is carried over from the computer games. If you use the gun on yourself, you'll shoot yourself. The narrator will then give you a sarcastic congratulations. Also found in Deja Vu is a mini-game of sorts, the slot machine. In fact, since you start out with a limited number of coins, this is the best way to get some extra cash, which you need for the cap rides. The problem is, the slot machines are slow and boring. You can't actually lose all your money, however, since an extra coin will always appear if you run out. But basically, using the coins on the slot machine over and over again gets old pretty quick. So anyway, your character is named Ace Harding, a detective, who starts off with no memory as to who he is and wakes up in the bathroom of an empty bar. You'll find clues to your identity as the game goes on. Exploring the areas around the bar, you'll find a dead body, and slowly a plot involving a kidnapping and a murder begins emerging. The writing is quite good and emulates that classic hard-boiled detective fiction. This man is missing something, namely life. I don't know how well this all worked in the Japanese version. According to Magweasel's Kevin Gifford, the Famicom version of Shadowgate, another of ICOM's MacVenture games, is considered to be kusoge in Japan for its over-the-top writing. Beyond the writing, the gameplay itself is decent, but there really aren't many puzzles in Deja Vu. Here, for example, you merely need to read the notes on the various kinds of medicines you find, then put the correct kind into a capsule, and then use it on yourself. This will restore your memory. But it mostly involves opening every drawer you encounter and then taking every item, such as notes that will fill in bits of the plot, and also give you addresses of new locations to travel to, using the taxicabs. But I'd say the main difference between this and the many Japanese adventure games is how open-ended it is. You can move around anywhere you want in the game world that isn't blocked by a locked door. You can pick up items anywhere, even if you don't have any idea what they're for. Unlike the Elf King and Samurai Sword, things don't suddenly appear out of nowhere after performing a certain action or talking to a certain character. There's going to be some backtracking involved, and the game is somewhat non-linear, unlike Samurai Sword, which has more of a perform an action and then move forward structure to it. I like the fact that you find the unconscious kidnap victim in the trunk, but just leave her there tied up. In fact, you have to give her a truth serum while she's unconscious, and then she'll give you out some information. In order to win Deja Vu, you must find all the important pieces of evidence, including things that will incriminate the actual perpetrators, and you must also get rid of any evidence that points towards you, such as the gun that was planted on you. And this is never quite spelled out for you, but you need to dispose of all of them in the sewer. Otherwise the cops will find the evidence and arrest you. And the game is stupidly finicky in some areas, namely here. I had already collected everything I needed and gotten rid of everything else, but when I went to the police station I was arrested because I didn't have enough evidence to prove who the real killer was. The missing piece of evidence turned out to be a letter I had in my possession, but I hadn't taken it out of the envelope that it came in. You see, Deja Vu uses nested inventories. I had the envelope in my inventory, but you need to open the envelope and take the letter to move it from the envelope sub-inventory to the main inventory. In other words, when I went to the cops, they took everything in my possession, including an envelope, but were unable to find the important letter inside the envelope, which is just plain stupid. But once I moved the letter and went to the police, I then beat the game. The end narration's pretty odd. It indicates the police have all the evidence on the real killer, but you are still tried for the murder, and your lawyer uses the evidence in court to get the real criminals to confess on the witness stand. I mean, if the evidence against them was that solid, why did the Illinois DA put you on trial instead of the other guys? Seems like a waste of taxpayer money. Anyway, Deja Vu is a solid game, but one that is seriously hampered by the NES controller. One of the selling points of the original computer version was the easy-to-use mouse-based interface. To move out a door, just click on the door. No typing required. Kemco's version requires 4 times as many steps to perform that same action. You click on the word open, then click on the door, then click on the word move, and then click on the door again. To move that letter, for example, you hit open, click on the arrow to flip the pages of your notebook, click on the entry for the envelope, then click take, and then click on letter again. And using the D-pad to navigate the menus is not fun, since your verbs are in one corner of the screen, the notepad's in another corner, and the button to flip the pages is in yet another corner. You are constantly moving your pointer all over the place. Unfortunately, I can't really consider Deja Vu to be a great game due to the rather mangled control scheme. Still, this game, as well as Uninvited, Shadowgate, and Maniac Mansion, helped introduce console gamers to adventure games, so it definitely has its place in game history. Oh lord, no. Could this title screen get any more hideous looking? Every single thing a video game title screen can do wrong, this one does. Not a very promising start. This is Moero, Junior Basket 2-on-2, the latest in Jellicoe's Moero sports game series. Moero Pro Yaku, or Bases Loaded, being the most well-known game in that series. At this point, Jellicoe is packing these things in these weird boxes out of windows so you can see the cartridge inside. I'm not really sure why. Maybe just sort of make them stand out on the shelf? This is apparently good enough for a US release under the name Hoops, with a much funkier cover. As the name Hoops sort of implies, this is not a pro basketball game. It's actually based on casual schoolyard basketball. You choose among several players with 70s style nicknames. You can choose 1 or 2 player with either 1-on-1 or 2-on-2, and there are also a couple options in regard to the rules, such as whether the winner or loser gets the next ball. Each player has his own strengths and weaknesses. Some are fast, some are slow, some are good at defense, some are good at shooting. In this option you start by shooting baskets to see who gets control of the ball. It's sort of a little timing minigame. You need to shoot right as the arrow is above the hoop. The game itself couldn't be simpler. In 1-on-1 mode, there's only one button. It shoots the ball. In 2-on-2 mode, the second button passes. The object? Try to steal the ball from your opponent and make a shot. Perhaps the best way to get a basket is to shoot from right up close to the basket, and that way you'll get a cool little cutscene, which sort of rips straight off from Double Dribble, even if you miss. I can't quite tell why you sometimes get a basket and sometimes you fail. I think there are sweet spots on the floor you need to be standing on in order to actually get one in the hoop. Another issue is that the CPU can steal the ball really easily and tends to run out in front of you, giving you a charging foul. The 2-on-2 mode's a bit more involved, and as mentioned has passing. One thing does bear mentioning, Hoops has a couple of female players mixed in. There's also an option for a shooting-only competition. So Hoops isn't really a bad game. I guess it's cool to see a half-court basketball game, but it won't make you forget Double Dribble or NBA Jam anytime soon. Our last game, and another game in the why the hell does this even exist category, is Takeshi no Sengoku Fuuunji. Something like Takeshi Sengoku Soldier of Fortune. And this is the third game based around Japanese TV personality Takeshi Kitano. The other two being, of course, Takeshi no Chozencho, which is from Taito, and that family trainer game based on the Takeshi's Castle TV show, which was released by Bandai. This, however, is a board game style video game. 2, 3, or 4 people can play. You start by entering in a name, selecting a character to represent you, and then off you go. The game seems to have a Sengoku era theme to it, which I guess sort of plays into Takeshi's Castle, in which Takeshi was dressed up in a historical costume. Each player takes turns rolling dice and moving around the board, racking up gold. This game doesn't seem too complicated. Some squares will give you bonus mini-games, or the frogs, for example, will make you lose a turn. Still, without really knowing the rules, it's pretty difficult to understand how to win. And as I mentioned, various mini-games pop up on certain squares, such as the golf game, though you just get one shot. You'll also encounter various individuals from time to time, including this weird-looking guy. And of course, what would this sort of thing be without a bunny girl? This is a little gambling mini-game in which you try to guess dice rolls. As you might recall, there were 2 options on the title screen, Sengoku and Party. Sengoku is what we're playing, and Party just allows you to just do only the mini-games. We'll actually encounter one last Takeshi Kitano-related game in a couple episodes, which means that the Famicom actually had more Takeshi-related games than it had Final Fantasy, Castlevania, or Super Mario Bros. Games. So, good job, Famicom. That wraps up another 15 games. Next time, we finish up November 1988 and move into December. We'll have a few oddities. Sunsoft releasing a Sega game for the Famicom, a little-known Square game, a bizarre Mario Brothers variation, and the big news, one of your all-time favorite NES games. I'll give you a hint, it involves a ninja. See you then.